Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the futures of both Thomas Bordeleau and Danil Gushchin with the San Jose Sharks. Now, I know for a lot of people, both of these players have kind of fallen out of favor a little bit, that they have been leapfrogged on many people's Sharks prospect depth charts by guys who are younger and or more promising than them, and many would even go so far as to describe both of these guys as players who are simply not quite skilled enough to find success on an NHL team in a top six, while not being gritty enough to find success in an NHL bottom six. And so that will make them these AHL tweener type of players who will never really end up making much of an impact at that top level. And these are potentially fair assessments of both of these players' careers. It is certainly possible that they'll never quite amount to much in the NHL, but that is not the point of this video. I am not going to be sitting here and arguing that they are actually elite talents, hidden diamond in the rough type of players, but instead that they should have been called up anyway already at least a couple of weeks ago, but the second best time being right now, so that they can be given a chance to show what they can do over the final 12 games. And I'll get into the reasons why by starting off with Bordeleau. While the reasons for both of these players are quite similar, they are in a little bit different situations. So with Bordeleau, he played a good chunk of games last season, a total of 27, but it was really the final 25 games that were most interesting. This was on a historically bad Sharks team that was even reaching new lows in the months of March and April, as the players had kind of just begun to pack it in and give up, waiting for the season to end. Bordeleau was one of the few bright spots. He had 11 points in 25 games, but where he truly elevated the Sharks was both on the face-off dot, where he had a pretty impressive 53% as a 21-year-old young center in the league, but also on the power play, where he elevated that 5-on-4 group for the Sharks to being one of the best in the league by the end of that season, at least during the final stretch that Bordeleau actually played. And so he had done enough to get himself a new contract with San Jose, a one-year prove-it type of deal from Mike Grier. And I thought he would be on the Sharks opening night roster. Maybe not necessarily playing that particular game, but hanging around so that he could be at the very least in and out of the lineup. But unfortunately for Bordeleau, he caught a bad break and was injured for the entirety of training camp and preseason. And while he thought that he might be left to hang around and rehab his injury in the NHL and eventually make his season debut, Mike Grier saw things differently and sent him down instead to the Barracuda, where he has remained ever since. Now, he missed the first few weeks of the season due to that same injury and eventually would return to the lineup with a pretty slow start, only 4 points in his first 15 games, but eventually he found his groove, and over these last 36 games that he has played, which is a significant sample size of multiple months, he is close to a point per game player with 34 points, and yet he has yet to get the call up to that NHL level. Now, some people might say, well, with Bordeleau, it's not simply just the points, it's about what he does on the other side of the puck, and this is, again, a very real and obvious criticism of Thomas Bordeleau as a player. But here's the thing. If you take a look at the Sharks' actual roster, I don't actually see much of a reason for why Bordeleau should not get called up, because currently the top six for San Jose is mostly set. Smith, Celebrini, Toffoli, Eklund, and Wenberg, they're not going anywhere. They are going to populate that top six until the end of the season. Graf is the one kind of wild card player where currently he certainly is deserving, but I won't say he's completely locked in for every single one of the remaining 12 games. But it is the Sharks' bottom six that doesn't really inspire a lot of confidence. There was a comment from a few games ago during a post-game presser that Ryan Warsofsky gave, where he essentially said, yes, players don't really have much to play for the end of this season in terms of making it to the playoffs, but they do have something to play for going into the following year, where they are simply just auditioning for spots either with the Sharks or on other potential teams that might look to sign them / trade for them in this offseason. And so there is that type of motivation to go for. And for certain players within the Sharks' bottom six, this certainly does make a lot of sense. For instance, Zach Ostapchuk, acquired in the Fabian Zetterlund trade, it is very obvious why Mike Grier would want to give him a ton of NHL game action. He is the centerpiece of that deal. He's going to be given a long leash. I'm not surprised he has already played a few games and will probably continue for the rest of this season. The same goes with Patrick Giles, who has only played a handful of games in the NHL this season and a smaller amount with the Sharks. He is someone who has been a rather intriguing player who could potentially fit into a fourth line role next season, so why not continue to give him reps? Another most most newest San Jose Shark, Cam Lund. He's a young player coming over from college. Give him the chance to show what he can do. We of course know that college players have a good amount of leverage when they sign that contract, and so he was probably told he would be getting NHL games. All of this is perfectly fine. But it comes to the other players, the wingers in the Sharks' bottom six, where it starts to make a little bit less sense. The Barclay Goodrows, the Ty Dellandrea, Carl Grundstrom, Noah Gregor, all of these players are fully known quantities. You have already seen them play, not just this season for 60 games, but many seasons prior to that. You are not going to be learning anything new about them over the final 12 games of this year. There is nothing that is actually going to stand out in any of these players' games that is going to make you make a different decision with them over this upcoming offseason. It is simply not going to happen. And so is it truly important to have these types of players get the final 12 games? Is it really going to get to the point where you're thinking, if only Dellandrea had gotten those extra 3 games instead of being healthy scratched in favor of someone like Bordeleau, then we could truly make an informed decision on if he should be on this roster next season? When he has already played like 70 games, you know exactly what you're going to get out of this player. It doesn't really make much sense to me. It'd be one thing if the Sharks were actually in the race for a playoff spot or in a playoff spot, and so they were truly trying to optimize their lineup to give them the best possible chance of winning every single game. And if Warsofsky truly believed Dellandrea gave them a better chance than having Bordeleau, I could get that. But right now, with the Sharks being last place, where it is actually technically better for them to be losing these games, I do not really see why you wouldn't want to have some young talent into the lineup. Even if there is a small chance that they ever actually become anything, that small chance is still better than the 0% chance that a player like Barclay Goodrow is, at over the age of 30, going to suddenly turn his career around and actually show you something different than what you already have seen from him time and time again. It is the equivalent of, let's say, buying a $5 scratch ticket where, yes, the chances of winning the jackpot are exceptionally low, and even just winning, let's say, $50 is probably not going to happen, but you could get your money back at the very least. You could get $5. Why would you just toss it in the trash? If you have already spent the money on it, you might as well see what you've got. It is the same exact perspective with Bordeleau here. He is a player who is on your team. He is a player who has shown at least a little bit of promise. You have 12 games. There's no reason to not have him in the lineup. Give him the chance to see what he can do, because there really isn't a fallback situation here. It's not like, okay, well, we'll just push it back and we'll see next year, because it is very, very possible, if not quite likely, that Bordeleau will not be back next season. Already, I mean, yes, he is an RFA, but already it is certainly possible that Mike Grier will decide to just not give him another contract. The fact that he was given a 1-year prove-it deal and then not even given the chance to prove it is already a head scratcher. But even if Mike Grier wanted to give him a contract, I certainly wouldn't blame Bordeleau for requesting a trade and saying very clearly, I'm not being given a chance here in San Jose to succeed, so I'd rather go elsewhere. And I imagine Mike Grier would respect that trade request, and he would be moved on from. And so these final 12 games here of the season are pretty much the last possible look that you can have of this player. And again, I just don't really see why you couldn't just insert him into the lineup here. There are many players who we do not need to see every single one of the remaining games actually get played by them. Might as well put him in a position, let's say playing on a third line with Giles and Kovalenko, or Giles and Cam Lund, or some sort of combination here, just to see what you have. The same can be said about Danil Gushchin. Many of the same arguments would be made, but like I said, he's in a bit of a different situation, because unlike Bordeleau, who has not played any NHL games this season, Gushchin actually has. He got 10 games back at the beginning of the year. But the thing about Danil Gushchin here is that this still, to me, remains probably the biggest mistake that Ryan Warsofsky has made all season long here in his first year as Sharks head coach. Because if we go all the way back to September, Danil Gushchin comes into that preseason and he absolutely dominates. In just 4 games, he puts up 10 points. This is more than any other player in the preseason in the NHL. Obviously, it doesn't really mean all that much, but it is still certainly better than getting 0 points in 4 preseason games. But what we learned at that point is that even though Ryan Warsofsky and Mike Grier very much preached the fact that there was a competition to make a roster spot on this current Sharks team, it didn't seem as though they quite meant that. Sure, it would be a battle to see who would be the fourth liner of every night between Carl Grundstrom and Ty Dellandrea, but in terms of actually like a young player making the lineup, it didn't really seem as though they were willing to allow that to happen until Gushchin came in and was so overwhelmingly effective, he threw a wrench in the plan, and they had to begrudgingly include him into the starting lineup. And the reason I say begrudgingly is that even though he showed all of this promise, his position in that opening night roster against the St. Louis Blues was on the fourth line. They didn't even put him into a third line position with Alex Wenberg to see if maybe he could do something. Nope, he was put in the fourth line and got about 10 minutes of ice time. Now, coming into this, after that preseason, Gushchin was probably sky high, on cloud nine, full of confidence, and then a fourth line role in which he really wasn't given a chance to do much, and then after that was healthy scratched for the next 3 games. If you were looking for the perfect way to crush a player's confidence, you don't have to look any further than how Warsofsky approached the Danil Gushchin situation at the beginning of this season. Now, in the end, Gushchin would return to the Sharks lineup, and he would play 9 more games for them, but at this point, the damage had kind of already been done. Even so, you would say, well, Gushchin was given a second line role, but that was mostly just on paper. Yeah, sure, he would get a few shifts with someone like Fabian Zetterlund, but even then his ice time very clearly did not reflect that of a second liner at just about 12 minutes of ice time per game, with a good minute and a half of that being on the power play. His actual even strength ice time was 10:46, in line with what a player like Ty Dellandrea has gotten this season. That is not a second liner, that is like barely even a third liner, and probably not even at that level. So while Gushchin sure on paper was put into that position, it doesn't quite feel as though he was truly given a chance to succeed. Sure, 1 point in 10 games still doesn't even look all that great, but I would also argue that Gushchin was a little bit snake bitten during this time, probably could have had at least a couple of extra points, which would have made it look a bit more respectable. I remember there was a shot that he took that hit, I think, off of like both posts at some point in a particular game, which was exceptionally unlucky, and that if you look past the stats, I would say he was actually one of the Sharks' better forwards. Obviously not at the level of a Toffoli or a Granlund or an Eklund, but certainly better than a Luke Cunnin or especially a Barclay Goodrow, who back in October didn't even look like he wanted to be on this team. And yet, when the moment that Macklin Celebrini returned from his injury, Gushchin was sent down, which sent a pretty clear message to me, and I imagine to Gushchin, that if Celebrini hadn't even been injured in the first place, Gushchin probably wouldn't have even stuck around as long as he did. And so he would return back to the AHL, where his stats were okay right out of the gate. I believe he had like 15 points in the first 26 games, which is certainly not bad, but not quite near the close to point per game level he had put up last season in the AHL. And again, I can't even necessarily blame him, because I imagine his confidence was completely shot at that point. Eventually, however, Gushchin has gotten back into this groove, and recently he has been on an absolute tear. In his last 19 games, which is still a pretty decent sample size, he has 27 points, most recently being named the AHL Player of the Week after a 4-point outing just a couple of days ago against the Bakersfield Condors. He has been absolutely lighting it up offensively, and like with Bordeleau, I fail to see the reason for why he hasn't already been called up, and why he should not be called up pretty much as soon as possible to play the final stretch of this season. Once more, and I will repeat myself here, there is nothing more to see out of some of these fourth line replacement level players that the Sharks have. We already know that Barclay Goodrow is penciled in for a lineup spot next season. He could be the most horrible player over these final 12 games. He could do absolutely nothing. He could sit down cross-legged on the ice and just sit there for the rest of the entire season, and then Warsofsky will still sing his praises in every post-game presser, and he will be put in a third-line role somehow next year. We do not need to see every single possible game of Barclay Goodrow this season. Giving the chance for a Bordeleau, giving the chance for a Gushchin can allow you to go with the asset management approach that Mike Grier has been praised for so much in his first 3 years as Sharks general manager. The way he flipped Mikael Granlund, flipped Mackenzie Blackwood and Anthony Duclair and Jake Wallman why are we now going to allow these two players to walk away for free without at least giving them the chance to show what they are capable of during a stretch of time in the season where pretty much nothing else actually matters? Because just as with Bordeleau, Gushchin, this might be your final 12 games. There was already a rumor this past offseason that Gushchin would be heading to the KHL, and while he himself denied that, and of course he played this year in North America, where there's smoke, there's fire, and I doubt anybody was making up rumors about a player who's really not all that notable in Danil Gushchin, and so I imagine there was a true consideration kept to actually returning to the KHL, and if he was willing to do it last offseason, after a year in which he was given probably not really the time of day by the Sharks, I imagine there is a very real likelihood that he returns to the KHL this offseason, if really not given the chance. And while you don't want to necessarily just be giving opportunities to players who threaten to leave your team, they have certainly performed well enough with the Barracuda that they are deserving of that chance all the same, and yet the Sharks have held off on actually giving it to them, which I just cannot really fathom the possible reason why. Perhaps earlier on it was because the Barracuda were in a semi-precarious situation holding on to a playoff spot, but after this extremely successful week that they have had, where in particular they won back-to-back games against the Bakersfield Condors, the team that is most likely to be knocking them out of a playoff spot and now have an 11-point lead with just 11 games remaining on the schedule, they seem in a fine enough position to allow at least one of these players, if not both of them, to be given a chance to show what they are capable of in the NHL. And so I wait patiently for hopefully this to happen, because it would feel like a very real wasted opportunity and extremely poor asset management if these two players were allowed to walk because, well, what if Carl Grundstrom actually has a hat trick in each of his last 12 games? Class dismissed.